Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel and this is the Hour of the Raven, your channel for everything Ravenloft, RPG, Dungeons and Dragons, and horror.
Today, we are going to review Ravenloft, the Horror's Routine, the new Dungeons and Dragons setting book for Ravenloft. Before we start, I would like to thank everyone who purchased and supported our latest project on DM's Guild, The Return of the Black Rose. Our massive campaign, as detailed as Curse of Strahd, explored the classic version of Sidicus, placing adventurers alongside Ganelon, the Wanderers, and the Blessed Knight as they confront the horrors of Inza and Azrael Dak. If you purchased the book, thank you very much, and if it's not asking too much, please consider leaving a review on DM's Guild and let us know what you thought about the adventure. Now, without further ado, let's dive into Wizards of the Coast's newest Ravenloft setting book.
Hour of the Raven.
Just as when Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft was released in 2021, this new setting book for Ravenloft arrives surrounded by anticipation, curiosity, and naturally, plenty of debate among fans of the setting. Many expected Ravenloft the Horror's Routine to be a continuation of the Ravenloft take started by Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, bringing new developments for the setting, answering some of the mysteries introduced there, or perhaps establishing a new editorial direction for Ravenloft. However, after reading the entire book, that this is not its purpose. The Horror's Routine is, above all else, an update of Ravenloft for the revised version of 5th edition, what many players informally refer to as D&D 5.5. And that immediately raises an important point. Roughly 60% to 70% of this book's content was already presented in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Many of the concepts, descriptions, explanation of the domains of dread, the dark powers, horror genres, and the overall structure of the setting return almost unchanged. This repetition is not necessarily a problem, nor is it unprecedented. The classic setting underwent similar revisions. In 1990, we had Ravenloft: The Realm of Terror, which first introduced Ravenloft as a campaign setting. A few years later, in 1994, the famous Ravenloft Red Box reintroduced the setting. Then came Domains of Dread in 1997, once again presenting the setting with updated rules and timeline. Each of these books revised, expanded, and reorganized existing material. The key difference is that classic Ravenloft had a continuous timeline. The adventures released between each campaign setting advanced the story of the setting, its Dark Lords, and its domains. Domains changed. Characters disappeared, returned, or were transformed by previous events. There was a clear effort to maintain continuity and coherence. When the Red Box and Domains of Dread were published, they did not merely update the rules, they consolidated years of narrative development. The 3rd edition material, produced by Arthaus and White Wolf, followed the same philosophy, preserving continuity while expanding the setting's lore. Ravenloft: The Horror's Routine takes a different path. Because modern Ravenloft is considered a cyclical nightmare reality, composed of isolated domains separated by the mists, the update largely consists of repacking existing material. There is no timeline to advance, there is no continuity to preserve, and perhaps the most frustrating aspect is what the book does not do. Not even the official 5th edition YouTube campaigns or the DM's Guild Adventure series, Mist Hunters, have any noticeable impact on the setting narrative. There are no answers to the mysteries introduced in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, such as the whereabouts of Azarin Rex or the plans of the enigmatic wizard Firan Zalohan. The setting simply is reintroduced without moving forward or addressing any of these questions. The book includes numerous updates to character creation. It revisits familiar options adapted for the revised rule set, including Dampiers, Hexbloods, and Reborn, alongside reworked dark gifts and backgrounds. The most significant addition among the playable species is the Lupin. For veterans of classic campaign settings, this is a particularly interesting inclusion. Lupins originally appeared in Mystara, where they were a race of canine humanoids, more closely associated with dogs than wolves. They possessed their own culture and traditions, and were notable enemies of werewolves, capable of tracking lycanthropes, regardless of their form. In this new book, however, they cease to be a distinct race. Instead, they are individuals cursed by lycanthropy, whose transformation is never fully completed, leaving them permanently trapped in a hybrid form between humanoid and wolf. For new players, this distinction probably won't matter. For long-time fans, however, it feels like another missed opportunity to connect the set to D&D broader history, particularly the often forgotten setting of Mystara. As I mentioned in my review of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, I personally prefer the lower fantasy tone of classic Ravenloft. However, the developers have been quite open in interviews about wanting to expand the range of playable monstrous characters. Dampiers covered vampires, Hexblood represented witches, and Reborns embodied Frankenstein-inspired creations. It seems only natural that werewolves would eventually join that list. As for subclasses, the book introduces 7 of them. 5 are adaptations of existing subclasses, updated for the revised rules, while 2 are entirely new. The Reanimator Artificer draws directly inspiration from both Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. These artificers specialize in reanimating corpses and creating grotesque stitched companions from multiple cadavers. The Hollow Warden Ranger explored themes of folk horror, allowing rangers to adopt supernatural traits and powers inspired by monsters and their enemies. Another noteworthy change involves the Dark Gifts. In Van Richten's Guide, they functioned as minor supernatural perks. Now they are directly tied to backgrounds and come with significantly harsher drawbacks. This change makes them feel closer to the corruption path found in classic Ravenloft, where power always came at a price. The Dungeon Master section continues to explore different horror genres. Gothic horror, cosmic horror, psychological horror, folk horror, body horror, ghost stories, and many others are all represented. The book still provides advice for running horror adventures, but it approaches the subject in a more concise and direct manner. Although the horrors within has a larger page count than Van Richten's Guide, many sections feel more condensed. The book also abandons certain optional systems introduced in Van Richten's Guide, such as Survivors, Seeds of Fear, and other mechanics. Its major new addition is the Haunted Bastion system. The concept is to provide players with a horror-themed base of operations within the Mists. In theory, it sounds interesting, but in practice I found it somewhat uninspiring. This is likely the most important section of the book. 17 domains receive detailed treatment, complete with maps, adventure hooks, campaign ideas, and full statistics for their Dark Lords. One of the most significant improvements from the last book is the inclusion of stat blocks for Dark Lords. This was one of the great criticisms of Van Richten's guide to Ravenloft. Although Dark Lords are unique villains and often the central antagonists of entire campaigns, the previous book only pointed readers toward generic monster stat blocks for the Dark Lords. This time, every one of the 17 Dark Lords receive a proper 5.5 edition stat block. However, not every domain returns. Of the 17 domains detailed in Van Richten's guide to Ravenloft, Bloodspur, Rishmulo, and ICAT lose their spotlight. On their place, we find Innsmouth, Sitkus, and Shadowlands. Sitkus and Shadowlands are reinterpretations of classic Ravenloft domains, while Innsmouth is entirely new. I recently dedicated an entire video to Sitkus, so I won't spend much time on it here. However, Sitkus serve as a perfect example of modern Ravenloft's internal inconsistencies. In Van Richten's guide, Sitkus existed only as an indirect reference associated with the domain of Claw, suggesting that its ruins were floating toward destruction to be consumed by the domain. Now Sitkus simply exists again, with no explanation whatsoever. It's as though both books were written without any concern for continuity. Shadowlands follow a similar pattern. Its roots are on the classic setting, and many elements are directly borrowed from the original and classic domain. Yet, continuity with the classic setting is abandoned entirely. And then we arrive at Innsmouth, perhaps the book's most controversial addition. Its Dark Lord is none other than Cthulhu himself. Classic Ravenloft already had its own cosmic horror Dark Lord in the figure of Gwydion, the imprisoned cosmic darkness lurking beyond the Obsidian Gate, deep within the Shadow Rift. I understand that Cthulhu is more famous and has greater mainstream appeal. Personally, however, I find the decision disappointing. I don't particularly enjoy taking literary characters and inserting them into Ravenloft without any reinterpretation. If we are simply importing Cthulhu, why not replace Strahd with Dracula or Mordenheim with Victor Frankenstein? Perhaps this approach would have worked better in Gothic Earth, which was especially designed for that kind of crossover. Furthermore, cosmic horror doesn't naturally fit 5th edition. The famous RPG Call of Cthulhu works because its protagonists are fragile. Dungeons & Dragons work because its protagonists become extraordinary heroes. Once you place Cthulhu in D&D, he inevitably becomes another villain to defeat. The result is a domain filled with cults, Lovecraftian monsters, ancient conspiracies, and cosmic threats, but one that often feels closer to dark fantasy adventure than true cosmic horror. Each domain also includes campaign concepts and even a short adventure. These adventures are generally less than a page long. The domain descriptions are shorter than those found in Van Richten's guide to Ravenloft. However, the inclusion of maps and complete Dark Lord stat blocks helps compensate for this. Several additional domains receive brief descriptions as well, including Sorang, Rizbilus, Skyena, Kinin, and even Khalidney from Dark Sun. The domain of Glor also returns as a devourer of forgotten domains. This time, its description features in its orbit of destruction a city of skulls that seems reminiscent of Cavitus, a city ruled by talking dogs that I honestly cannot connect to any previous domain, as well as a blood-soaked iron arena that appears to reference Ravenloft's strange fighting game, Iron and Blood. The book introduces dozens of new creatures, while updating many classic Ravenloft monsters. Much of this material is tied to Innsmouth and Lovecraftian horror, including Shoggoths, Elder Things, Starspawn, Eteans, and other creatures from Cthulhu mythos. There is also room for classic Ravenloft monsters, including updated versions of Remishka, Brain in Jars, and Strahd skeletons. Most importantly, iconic characters finally receive full statistics. Van Richten, Esmeralda, the Weathermaid sisters, and Madame Eva all received proper game statistics. This was something sorely lacking in the previous book. Perhaps this is where the book improves the most. Ravenloft the Horrors Within is visually superior to Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. The graphic design is more attractive and polished. The book is filled with maps and artwork, including numerous full-page illustrations. The artistic direction feels much more confident, with images embracing both horror and fantasy simultaneously. The color palette reflects the modern vision of Ravenloft, vibrant and saturated, while still conveying danger and violence. Not every choice had worked for me. Azalin Rax's new appearance feels far more edgy and closer to Vecna than to his classic portrayal, including those from previous 5th edition books. Likewise, if there was ever any doubt that the new hierarchy draws inspiration from Stargate, that doubt is gone now. Several pyramids and temples look remarkably similar to alien spacecrafts. In interviews, the developers have mentioned films such as Dario Argento's Suspiria as visual inspirations, and that influence is evident in the book's saturated colors. Although I still prefer a dark and more restrained aesthetic for Ravenloft, I have to admit that the final result is visually impressive and highly effective. One of the book's most surprising aspects is the acknowledgement of the setting's past. Throughout the revised domains, I noticed attempts to reconnect with elements of the classic Ravenloft lore, even while maintaining the modern interpretation. One example is the reappearance of Adan in Lamordia, now recreated by Victor Mordenheim as part of her efforts to find Elise. More importantly, for the first time since Ravenloft returned in 5th edition, the new book explicitly acknowledged the existence of the classic setting. A brief passage recognizes the former core and presents it as an alternative option for dungeon masters who prefer that style of campaign. It's a very small gesture, far too small, but it's still more acknowledgement than Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft offered. The earlier book represented a complete remake of Ravenloft, without even recognizing the campaign setting that existed before it. Ravenloft the Horrors Within improved on this, and even concludes with acknowledgements and thanks directed toward classic Ravenloft authors and the Fraternity of Shadow fan community. In the end, Ravenloft the Horrors Within is a better book than Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft in nearly every aspect. Although its text is often more concise, it offers better and more plentiful artwork, stronger visual design, useful maps, and complete statistics for 17 Dark Lords. It includes more monsters, more classic characters, and demonstrates a greater appreciation of Ravenloft's legacy. On the other hand, it also repeats a substantial amount of material from Van Richten's Guide. Perhaps 60 to 70% of its content is essentially a revised presentation of material that already existed. More importantly, it continues the same philosophy of remaking and discontinuity of the previous lore established in 2021 by the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Ravenloft remains a collection of disconnected nightmares, rebuilt atop the remains of previous editions. There is no evolving timeline, No meaningful continuity, not even between two products released for the same edition. If you disliked Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, this book is unlikely to change your mind. But if you enjoy the modern vision of Ravenloft and are looking for an update horror toolkit for the newest version of Dungeons & Dragons, then Ravenloft The Horrors Within is unquestionably a stronger product than Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. And what about you? What did you think of the new book? Join us, subscribe to the channel, and in our next video we will return to the mists to continue our exploration of the terrifying created, the dread golems of Ravenloft.